In the deep winter of 1902, a solitary trapper working the remote forests of Idaho's Priest Lake began encountering something that defied all natural explanation. I, Samuel McKinnon, dismissed the first signs as bear activity, until the undeniable evidence of its presence broke the world I thought I knew. What happened there should have stayed buried. I am an old man now, my hands gnarled and trembling slightly as they rest upon a worn oak table, scarred with decades of forgotten meals and quiet contemplation. My back will not straighten fully, a permanent curve from years of bending over traps and carrying heavy packs through the unforgiving wild. A single kerosene lamp casts a soft, yellow glow across the dim room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. The only sounds are the gentle creak of an old house settling and the slow, deliberate rhythm of my own breath. Most of the men I knew from those days are long gone, swallowed by time or the wilderness itself. But my memory remains clear, a stark, vivid landscape etched behind my eyes, as sharp as a fresh-honed blade. I remember every detail of those 3 weeks in the icebound forests, a time that shattered my understanding of the natural world and forever altered the path of my life. I remember February of 1902. A biting wind had swept down from the north, laying a deep, unbroken blanket of white across the entire Priest Lake wilderness, transforming the dense cedar and hemlock forests into a cathedral of silence. I was 38 years old then, a man forged by years of physical labor in the untamed regions of the Pacific Northwest. My frame was tall and wiry, carrying the lean strength of a seasoned trapper, not bulk, but sinew and resilience. A shock of thick, unruly auburn hair, often dusted with snow or matted from my knitted wool cap, had earned me the nickname Red years prior. My eyes, a sharp, intelligent blue, were constantly scanning the environment, a network of fine lines at their corners, from squinting against sun and snow. They held a deep, knowing glint that spoke of an intimate familiarity with the wild. My face was weather-beaten, ruddy from constant exposure to the harsh elements, with a prominent, slightly crooked nose and a jawline often obscured by a short, neatly trimmed beard flecked with frost. My hands, calloused and scarred, the fingers thick and nimble from handling traps and tools, moved with unpracticed efficiency that spoke of a lifetime spent in these woods. A faint, jagged scar, a relic from an old logging accident, ran just above my left eyebrow, a constant reminder of the wilderness's unforgiving nature. I wore a heavy, well-worn wool coat in a dark green, its thick fabric providing a meager defense against the relentless cold over thick canvas trousers. Sturdy leather boots, laced high, crunched rhythmically through the fresh powder, and thick buckskin gloves protected my hands from the bitter air. Across my back was slung a Winchester Model 1894 rifle, a sturdy lever-action weapon made of blued steel and dark walnut wood, well-maintained and reliable, a constant companion and tool of survival. My trapper's cabin, a small, rough-hewn log structure chinked with mud and moss, sat nestled deep in the cedar forest near Priest Lake, a good day's journey from the nearest settlement. It was a sanctuary, smelling of wood smoke, cured hides, and pine sap. But the isolation was absolute. The frigid air, sharp and clean, carried only the faint, crisp scent of frozen pine needles. The towering cedar and hemlock trees, ancient evergreens draped heavily with snow, rose like silent sentinels all around the cabin, their branches bowed under the weight. Priest Lake itself, a vast, still sheet of ice and snow, reflected the gray winter sky, an immense, frozen mirror stretching to the horizon. I had hauled my supplies in by sled and on foot, navigating the dense forest with a practiced ease, a lone figure against the immense, white, silent landscape. The silence of the wilderness was a comfort to me then, a familiar blanket woven from the absence of human noise. I had arrived in the last week of January, settling into my solitary routine. Each morning, before the weak winter sun could fully breach the heavy canopy, I would rise, stoke the stone fireplace, and prepare for the day's work. My trap lines, stretched lines of steel traps, a mix of conibear and leg-hold types, were set strategically in the snow, often near game trails or water sources, used to catch beaver, marten, and other fur-bearing animals. These were simple, practical tools of my trade, extensions of my will in this unforgiving environment. My days were a rhythm of checking traps, skinning catches, mending gear, and navigating the vast, snow-covered expanse. For the first week, things were as they should be. A few marten, a beaver, a lynx, good pelts. The forest was quiet, yes, but winter often brought a certain hush. The snow muffled all sound, creating a profound stillness that was both beautiful and at times unsettling. Yet, as the days wore on, I noticed a deeper, more pervasive quiet. The usual chatter of squirrels was absent, no flash of a chickadee against the dark boughs. A deep, unnatural silence had settled over the woods, a quiet that felt wrong, as if the forest itself held its breath. The air remained crisp, cold, and utterly still, but something about the stillness began to prickle at the back of my neck. I dismissed it as fancy, the loneliness of winter playing tricks on a man. I had spent countless winters alone. I knew these woods. It was late in the afternoon of my 8th day out, the short gray daylight already beginning to fade, painting the snow with long blue shadows. When I stumbled upon them, I was near a frozen stream, a place where I usually found good beaver sign, checking a line of 3 leg-hold traps. The light was growing dim, casting the towering cedar trees into deeper silhouette. My breath plumed white in the frigid air as I knelt beside a trap, resetting its trigger. When I straightened, my eyes, accustomed to scanning for the slightest disturbance, caught something in the thick, pristine snow just beyond a cluster of snow-laden huckleberry bushes. An impression. A track. I'd seen thousands of tracks in my life. Bear, wolf, deer, moose. I knew them all, could read them like scripture. This was different. I walked towards it slowly, my sturdy leather boots crunching softly on the frozen surface. The initial impression was of immense size. My first thought was a grizzly bear, a particularly large one, though grizzlies rarely lingered this deep in winter. Still, it was the most rational explanation for a track so large. But as I drew closer, the shape of the impression began to register as wrong. It was not a bear. I knelt, pushing aside a low-hanging evergreen branch heavy with snow, my buckskin-gloved hand hovering over the imprint. The sheer scale of it was jarring against the otherwise unbroken expanse of white. A track, nearly 18 inches long, pressed deep into the packed snow. My own boot, a size 11, looked small and insignificant beside it. It was clearly a 5-toed print, but the overall shape, the broadness of the heel, and the distinct, almost human-like splay of the toes were unlike any animal I had ever encountered in my decades in the wilderness. There was no claw mark, no telltale scratch of a bear's long nails. My blood ran cold. The silence of the forest, already unnerving, now felt oppressive, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for me to understand. I traced the outline of a toe with a gloved finger, the snow firm and unyielding beneath the leather. This was not a bear. A grizzly would leave a wide, heavy track. but its claws would be evident, and its gait would be distinctly quadrupedal. This track, however, indicated a bipedal stride. It appeared to be walking upright. The stride length between individual prints was impossibly long, suggesting a creature of enormous height and power. I stood slowly, my eyes following a clear line of these monstrous prints, stretching away into the deepening gloom of the dense cedar forest, leading me away from my familiar trap lines, away from the safety of my cabin. The vast, snow-covered wilderness, once a comforting home, suddenly felt alien, imbued with an unknown and chilling presence. The silence deepened around me, a heavy, watchful quiet. The last sliver of the sun's fading light caught the tops of the ancient evergreens, painting them a fleeting orange before they surrendered to the encroaching darkness. A cold dread, unlike any I had ever known, began to bloom in my chest. The tracks led deeper into the shadowed trees, a silent, stark invitation into the unknown. I knew I should turn back. Every instinct screamed for me to retreat, but the trapper's curiosity, a stubborn, fatal pull, held me fast. I had to know what had made those tracks. That stubborn pull, a trapper's ingrained need to understand the wilderness, overruled the rising fear in my gut. I shifted the Winchester Model 1894 rifle slightly on my shoulder, its blued steel cold against the heavy wool of my coat, and began to follow the enormous prints into the deepening gloom. The trail led me away from my usual trap lines, away from the familiar paths I had trod for years, pushing deeper into a denser, darker part of the cedar forest near the Canadian border. This was a region even the local Kalispel tribes rarely ventured into, a place spoken of in hushed tones, a wilder, more ancient section of the woods. The towering cedar trees here grew closer together, their snow-laden branches intertwining overhead, creating a thick, oppressive canopy that swallowed the last vestiges of the winter light. The air, already frigid, seemed to grow colder, carrying with it a new, subtle scent, something musky and wild, yet ancient and alien, a smell unlike any animal I knew. Each crunch of my sturdy leather boots on the frozen snow felt unnaturally loud in the profound silence that had settled over the woods. As I proceeded, the forest itself began to feel wrong. The unnatural silence persisted, an absolute absence of the usual sounds of the wild. No birdsong, no rustle of squirrels in the high branches, no distant howl of a wolf. It was as if every living creature had fled, leaving behind only the snow and the trees and me. The dimming light under the heavy canopy played tricks on my eyes, transforming familiar shapes into shifting shadows. A gnarled root became a coiled snake, a snow-covered boulder, a hunched beast. The air itself felt heavy, thick with unseen presence, and I found myself constantly scanning the dark boughs above, my sharp blue eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for any disturbance in the pattern of the snow-covered branches. My heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat of rising apprehension. I gripped the cold steel of my rifle tighter, my calloused fingers instinctively checking the safety. The tracks, distinct and undeniable, continued to lead me through this unsettling stillness. They moved with an unnerving purpose, a long, powerful stride that seemed to flow effortlessly over the deep snow, barely disturbing the pristine surface beyond the impression itself. The sheer size of them, nearly 18 inches long, with those 5 splayed toes, made my rational mind reel, desperately searching for an explanation that simply wasn't there. No animal I knew walked like this, with such immense, bipedal grace. The trees here were older, their trunks thicker, their bark a darker, richer brown, and the snow on their branches seemed to hang in heavier, more ominous drapes. The further I went, the more the isolation pressed in, a suffocating weight that made me feel impossibly small, a solitary speck in a vast, cold, and now deeply unsettling wilderness. After what felt like an hour of relentless tracking, the dense cedar forest abruptly thinned, opening into a small, natural clearing, perhaps 30 yards across. This was an elk clearing, a place where deer and elk would often gather in warmer months, but now it was a scene of stark, brutal horror. The snow here was deeply disturbed, churned up and stained with dark, crimson blood that stood out starkly against the white. Tree branches, heavy with snow, hung low around the edges of the clearing, framing a view of the dark, silent forest beyond. The air was utterly still, heavy with the bitter cold, but now carried a new, sickening smell. The metallic tang of fresh blood, mingling with that musky, wild, ancient odor I had noticed earlier. In the center of this disturbed expanse lay an elk carcass, a partially consumed beast, its fur matted and bloodied, its large body twisted at an unnatural angle in the deep snow. It was a grisly, disturbing sight. The elk's eyes, wide and glassy, were frozen open, staring blankly at the gray, overcast sky. Large chunks of flesh had been torn away from its flanks and hindquarters, not neatly butchered, but ripped with immense, savage force. Ragged edges of muscle and hide hung loosely, exposing bone beneath. This was no clean kill by a wolf pack, no swift work of a cougar. The sheer violence of the act, the raw, brutal power evident in the dismemberment, sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. My stomach clenched, and a cold sweat broke out on my brow despite the freezing air. I knelt cautiously in the snow, my rifle still clutched in my gloved hands, scanning the tree line, my senses screaming at me to be aware. The tracks of the monstrous bipedal creature were everywhere in the clearing, mingling with the elk's desperate death throes. I examined the torn flesh of the carcass, then the disturbed snow nearby. The impressions in the snow surrounding the elk were clear. Large, five-fingered hands, pressed deep, distinct from the bipedal footfalls. The creature had used hands, not claws or teeth, to tear the meat. This detail, more than the size of the tracks or the brutalized carcass, chilled me to the bone. It shattered any remaining rational explanations, any lingering hope that I was simply dealing with an unknown, oversized beast. Hands implied intelligence. Hands implied a deliberate, almost human, action. This was something fundamentally wrong, something that defied every law of nature I had ever known. True darkness began to fall swiftly, the short winter day giving way to a deep, profound night. The shadows lengthened, merging with the dense tree line, making it impossible to see more than a few yards into the woods. A shiver, not from the cold, ran down my spine. That feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes fixed upon me, intensified to an unbearable degree. It was no longer a vague apprehension, but a certainty that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Then, a sound, not from the ground, but from directly above me. Branches snapping in the dense forest canopy, a series of sharp, heavy cracks that were definitely not from wind, but from immense, heavy movement. My head snapped up, my blue eyes darting frantically upwards into the impenetrable darkness of the boughs. I caught a fleeting, indistinct movement between the trees, a massive, dark shape, a flash of dark reddish-brown fur, a sense of immense bulk moving with impossible stealth, almost too fast to register, high among the snow-laden branches. It was there, then gone, a phantom in the gloom, a nightmare silhouette against the barely lighter sky. A low, guttural sound then echoed from the dense woods to my left, a sound that was not quite a growl, not quite a moan, but something else entirely. It was deep, resonant, and carried an unnerving, intelligent quality, a sound that was simply wrong. It was a sound that made the very air vibrate, settling deep into my bones. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt a primal, animalistic fear seize me, locking my muscles. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to raise my rifle, but my body refused to obey. The cold dread had blossomed into full-blown terror, leaving me rooted to the blood-stained snow in the center of that terrible clearing, utterly exposed and vulnerable, staring into the impenetrable darkness, knowing now with absolute certainty that I was not alone. The air grew thick with tension, a suffocating blanket of dread. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the soul, that the thing that had made the tracks, the thing that had torn the elk apart with its hands, was still here. It was watching me, and it was waiting. The air grew thick with tension, a suffocating blanket of dread. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the soul, that the thing that had made the tracks, the thing that had torn the elk apart with its hands, was still here. It was watching me, and it was waiting. Then, a sudden, violent force ripped through the branches directly above me. The snow-laden boughs of an ancient cedar shuddered and groaned, shedding a flurry of white powder that momentarily obscured my view. Through the swirling flakes, a massive, dark shape detached itself from the canopy. It was the Priest Lake Ape-Man, a creature of nightmare and impossible scale. Its estimated 8-foot height was even more imposing as it descended, not falling, but moving with an impossible agility that defied its immense bulk. Long, powerful arms, covered in thick, dark, reddish-brown hair, hung nearly to its knees, aiding its silent, fluid drop. It landed on the snow-covered ground with a soft thud that vibrated through the frozen earth, its massive frame absorbing the impact with ease. The creature stood before me now, no longer a fleeting shadow or a distant sound, but a monstrous, physical presence, its shaggy fur matted with clinging snow, almost blending with the deepening twilight. For several heart-stopping moments, the enormous ape-man and I regarded each other across the small, blood-stained clearing. It stood perhaps 20 yards away, a silent, dark monolith against the backdrop of the dense cedar forest, its head slightly tilted, as if assessing me. My own breath hitched in my throat, a ragged, frozen gasp that seemed impossibly loud in the profound silence that had fallen once more. The creature's deep-set, intelligent amber eyes fixed on me, glowing with an unsettling, predatory light in the dimming evening. They were not the eyes of a beast, driven by instinct alone. No, these eyes held an ancient, evaluating intelligence that seemed to register every detail of my presence, from the fine lines around my own sharp blue eyes to the grip I had on my Winchester Model 1894 rifle. I felt utterly exposed, every instinct screaming at me, every hair on my body standing rigid with primal dread. It was a gaze that pierced through me, understanding something profound and terrible about my very being. Then, just before it acted, a subtle, disturbing shift occurred in the creature's grotesque features. Beneath the heavy brow ridge and the wide, flat nose, its wide mouth, capable of forming expressions that were eerily human-like, seemed to pull back slightly. It was not a snarl of aggression, nor the baring of fangs. Instead, it was an expression disturbingly close to a knowing, humorless smile, A flash of human-like recognition on an inhuman face, perfectly executed but horribly out of place. The corners of its mouth stretched just enough to reveal a disturbing intelligence, a malicious understanding that chilled me to the bone. It was a silent, terrible acknowledgement that it knew exactly what I was and what I feared. This was not an animal. This was something that thought, that understood, that knew. The air around us seemed to crackle with this unspoken, malevolent communication, the very light in the clearing seeming to dim further at the sight. That was when the Priest Lake ape man let out a bone-chilling scream. It began as a low, guttural rumble deep in its chest, a sound that vibrated through the ground beneath my feet, then erupted into a raw, powerful shriek that echoed across the frozen lake and through the silent, snow-laden forests. It was unlike any sound I had ever heard in the wilderness, a sound that struck primal fear into my very core. The intensity of it seemed to tear at the fabric of the cold air, reverberating off the snow-covered trunks of the ancient evergreens. It wasn't merely loud. It was a sound imbued with an unnerving, intelligent quality, a sound that was simply wrong. It spoke of immense, unfathomable age and unchecked power, a cry of dominion over a territory it had claimed long before men walked these woods. My ears rang, and a sharp, piercing pain shot through my skull, as if the sound itself was trying to shatter my mind. Despite being armed with my trusty Winchester Model 1894 rifle, a sturdy lever-action weapon of blued steel and dark walnut wood, Samuel McKinnon, a man hardened by years of solitary labor, found himself completely paralyzed with terror. My fingers, thick and nimble from handling traps and tools, refused to obey, frozen on the cold metal of the rifle's stock. My mind screamed for me to act, to raise the rifle, to aim for the creature's chest or its intelligent amber eyes, but my body refused to obey. Every muscle locked, rooted to the blood-stained snow in the center of that terrible clearing. My breath fogged heavily in the bitter cold, coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I could feel the tremors starting in my legs, a deep, uncontrollable shivering that had nothing to do with the freezing temperatures. It was sheer, overwhelming dread, a primal horror that stripped away all my competence, all my training, leaving me utterly helpless. The world narrowed to that monstrous, shaggy form and those knowing, terrible eyes. As suddenly as it had appeared, the ape-man turned. It did not lumber or hesitate. Its massive frame pivoted with astonishing speed, a fluid, silent motion that belied its size. In an instant, it vanished into the dense cedar forest, melting into the deep shadows as if it were a part of the oppressive gloom itself. There was no crashing through underbrush, no heavy footsteps in the snow, only a fleeting glimpse of its dark reddish-brown fur disappearing between the towering trunks. The forest fell back into a profound, unnatural silence, a silence even deeper and more oppressive than before, as if the very air had been sucked out of the world. All that remained were its massive 18-inch tracks pressed deep into the undisturbed snow, the half-eaten elk carcass brutally torn and twisted, and the lingering, musky scent of its presence on the frigid, still air. I stood there, rifle still slung across my back, my weather-beaten face a mask of frozen terror, watching the empty space where the creature had been, my breath still fogging in ragged clouds, a ghost of the scream still echoing in my ringing ears. The moon, a sliver of cold white light, began to peek through the heavy clouds, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters in the silence. Slowly, painfully, movement returned to my limbs. The cold had bitten deep into my muscles, stiffening them, but the paralysis of fear, was what truly held me. I stood there, shivering uncontrollably, the raw, metallic tang of fear thick in my mouth, watching the empty space where the Priest Lake ape man had vanished. The profound, unnatural silence had returned, pressing in on me, making the crisp crackle of my own breath seem like a roar. My legs felt like lead, each step a conscious, agonizing effort, but the instinct to flee, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that clearing, was a powerful, driving force. I stumbled out of the blood-stained snow, away from the brutally torn elk carcass, moving mechanically through the deepening gloom of the cedar forest, every shadow seeming to hold the intelligent, amber eyes of the creature. The 3-day journey back to my trapper's cabin and then towards civilization blurred into a haze of primal fear and bone-deep exhaustion. I did not stop to check my trap lines, abandoning the carefully laid roots and the valuable furs I might have caught. My mind was a jumble of disjointed images, the creature's immense, shaggy form, the terrible knowing in its eyes, the grotesque, almost human smile, and the bone-chilling scream that still echoed in my ears. I moved with a desperate, animalistic urgency, driven by a desperate need to escape the wilderness that now felt hostile and alive with unseen eyes, a place that was no longer mine. The heavy snow, once a familiar comfort, now felt like a shroud, and the towering ancient evergreens, their branches heavy with snow, seemed to lean in, silent witnesses to my terror. I ate little, slept less, my senses hyper-alert to every snap of a twig, every whisper of the wind through the frozen branches. When Samuel McKinnon finally reached the small logging town of Coolin, a collection of rough-hewn shacks and a single, muddy main street beside the lake, his appearance was shocking to those who knew him. My tall, wiry frame was gaunt, my weather-beaten face pale and drawn, etched with lines of profound exhaustion. What truly stunned them, though, was my hair. The shock of thick, unruly auburn hair that had earned me my nickname was now streaked with wide, undeniable bands of pure white, as if the bitter cold had leached the color from it. My sharp, intelligent blue eyes, once constantly scanning the environment with a knowing glint, were now wide and haunted, holding a deep, distant terror. My once steady hands, calloused and nimble from handling traps and tools, now trembled uncontrollably, a fine, ceaseless tremor that betrayed the shattering of my nerves. I was physically exhausted and mentally shattered, a ghost of my former self, a man who had seen too much. I tried, in those first few days back, to recount my story to a few trusted individuals. Old Man Hemlock, a grizzled prospector who had seen his share of strange things, listened with a blank face, then simply grunted, "Some places ain't meant for men." Red, the local reverend, a stout man with a booming voice, tried to explain it as delirium, brought on by exposure and solitude, a trick of the mind in the desolate winter. His eyes held pity, not belief. Their skepticism, their hushed dismissals, made me retract into myself. I saw the doubt, the polite disbelief, the way their eyes would slide away from mine when I spoke of the creature's intelligent gaze. I learned quickly that some truths were too terrible to share, too far outside the accepted understanding of the world. So, Samuel McKinnon, the pragmatic trapper, the man who knew the wilderness better than most, kept his secret. I took my payment for the season's furs, fewer than usual, and bought passage on the next stagecoach out of Coolin, leaving the deep woods of Priest Lake behind. I made a solemn vow then, a vow I kept for the rest of my life. I would never return to that section of the Priest Lake wilderness again. Some territory, I understood, was simply not ours to claim. Decades passed. I'm an old man now, Samuel McKinnon, sitting in a quiet room far from the snow-laden cedar forests of Idaho. My hands, once thick and nimble, now shake too much to hold an axe, the gnarled fingers aching with the cold that seems to live in my bones. My back won't straighten fully, a permanent stoop from years of labor, and my eyes, though still sharp for my age, dim with the setting sun. But my memory is clear. It is a burden I carry, as vivid today as it was in that bitter February of 1902. I remember every detail of those 3 weeks, the height of it, the wrongness of its proportions, the way its massive frame moved with impossible grace, the musky, ancient scent that clung to the frigid air, and the intelligence in those terrible amber eyes. Most of all, I remember the smile, that human expression on an inhuman face that said it understood exactly what we were and what we feared. The world changed around me. Young men and women today, with their automobiles and their electric lights, don't believe the old stories. They have machines now, diesel engines and steel cables, powerful chainsaws that chew through ancient timber. They think they're different from us, stronger, better equipped, masters of a tamed wilderness. They scoff at tales of ape men and ancient spirits. But machines make noise that carries far through the forest, a loud, intrusive roar that announces their presence for miles. And the thing that watches from between the towering trees doesn't experience time like we do. Decades are nothing to it. It has learned patience over generations, over millennia. It can wait a lifetime between encounters, its ancient intelligence observing, learning, adapting to each new intrusion. I'll be gone soon. My part in this story will end, swallowed by the passage of time. But the story itself continues. Sometimes I get word through old timber connections, or I read a small, vague article in a local paper. Another crew walking off a job, leaving good wages behind, without explanation. Another small company closing an operation near the lake, citing unforeseen environmental challenges or surveying errors. The details are always vague, always rationalized away, buried beneath official reports or dismissed as wild speculation. But I know the pattern. I know it's still there, still walking the deep cedar forests where the snow lies, unbroken for months. Still watching from the shadows of the ancient evergreens, still claiming its territory with a patience that outlasts human memory, human ambition, and human arrogance. In those remote, snow-laden forests around Priest Lake, where the winter silence is broken only by the crack of ice or the whisper of wind, where the shadows stretch long and dark under perpetually overcast skies, it's there, a silent, shaggy sentinel, watching, waiting. Some things claim a place so completely that we can only recognize their ownership and retreat. I made my peace with that long ago. The only thing I know for certain is that it's still waiting, not for me, not anymore. My time is past, but for the next crew, the next expedition, the next generation foolish enough to venture into its territory. And they will come. They always do.